Today I have a crazy game for you. You're going to see Magnus Carlsen drag Daniel Naroditsky straight to hell, right into a middle game of such nightmarish complexity that both players struggle to navigate their way through a game that has clearly gotten out of control, where the only thing that is clear to anyone is that it will not end in a draw. You will see brilliant tactics, certain doom, followed by sudden and unexpected redemption. In short, just about everything you'd ever want to see in a chess game. It was played just this past week on chess.com. It's a blitz game. It's truly mind-boggling to see a game of this caliber played at such a time control. But enough beating around the bush, let's get into it. Magnus is playing white, and like the last video I made, he is again facing a Najdorf Sicilian. But unlike the last video I made, instead of playing bishop to e2 on move 6 here, he goes with f3, which is even more unusual than bishop e2, although it might actually be stronger. Most human players prefer a move like bishop to e3 because it gives white more flexibility. The game can still go in various directions. White could castle on the king side, but with this move f3, you're announcing to the world right out of the gate, hey, I'm going to be castling queenside and I'm going to be pushing these pawns on the king side. But the engine actually prefers this move, probably because it's a strong plan. It might be the strongest plan in this position, so hey, why not play the best line and let everybody know it? This move f3 will often transpose to the main line anyway, which is what happens after Naroditsky's e5. Knight goes back to b3, bishop e6, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen to d2. And if I'm not mistaken, this just may be the most popular chess opening of all time. I think there's been more chess games, at least at a high level, with these moves for white and black than any other opening, being the most popular line in the Sicilian. And these players keep going right down the main path until we get the move a5 from Daniel Naroditsky. It's not the most common. Playing the pawn to a6 with the goal of pushing b5 is more popular, but this is a very well-known opening plan for black. I've faced this move many times myself, and I, along with most other players, will simply play a4. Obviously, you don't want black to play a4 and kick your knight back, so you play a4, and then black will play knight to c6 or knight to a6 and look to get into the b4 square as soon as possible. That's a hole in white's position. Of course, now black has this hole on b5, which white will put a piece onto, and the game will typically go something like this, with black occupying b4 and white eventually occupying b5 with a piece. This is the line the engine gives, and Stockfish says that white is almost a pawn better here, which I don't really believe. If that was really the case, I don't think this line would be so popular among human players, but who knows? I'd be curious to play the engine against itself and see if it thinks it can maintain that one pawn advantage very far into the middle game. I do know that that pesky knight is close to the white king, and there's no super convenient way for white to get it out of there anytime soon. But this is not what was played in the game. Magnus Carlsen played a very uncommon move here. He played g4, allowing a4, kicking his knight back to a hideous square. That's the only place it can go. So why would you allow black to do this and get in a3 on the next move? Well, it's because you can play b3. Obviously, you're not going to take the pawn on a3 and open this file towards your king. That would be suicide. So you bypass the pawn, and now black is in no position to trade off any of the pawns in front of your king. You have some pretty permanent pawn cover here, but you do have this big gaping hole on b2, which is being hit by this pawn. So it's an interesting kind of a game where white still has prospects of a standard kingside pawn storm, but black has this situation where all he really has to show for his queenside expansion towards the white king is this pawn, which he's hoping will be a permanent fixture, and it will carry its own threats into the middle game and further if he can maintain it there and white doesn't win it. His obvious dream would be to get a queen into here someday. There could be back rank mating ideas since this king does not have the b2 square to escape to. And you're going to see just how important this pawn is later on in the game. Danya continues with knight to c6. And now the best move for Magnus, which he did not play, was knight to b5. As white here, you really want to get in c4 as soon as possible. It does a lot of things at the same time. It locks down this d6 pawn, so black is going to have a hard time ever playing d5. You're opening up the c2 square for the knight to get back into the game. You're providing some lateral coverage of that b2 point. In a position like this, white has all the space, black has all the weaknesses. This pawn isn't really significant anymore. It's being targeted by two knights. Okay, so that's what you want as white. And what black should actually do is sack a pawn with knight to d4. Takes, takes, bishop takes, just so you can get in the move d5 and try to open things up in the center, because black does have the better development. This knight on a1 is just horrible. And white should not take on d5 here, should push e5, and is still better, but black definitely has some decent prospects here. But Carlsen misses the mark here. Instead of playing knight to b5, he plays g5, which is normally a good move to play in this opening whenever you can get it in, but here it's not particularly great, because what Danya could have played here was knight to h5. He didn't play that. He moved the knight to d7 instead, which was a mistake. But the point is, if white were to play knight to b5 now, you could jump into d4 with your knight, and it's not even a pawn sacrifice anymore. Knight takes, and then you capture on d4 like this, and then the pawn on g5 falls. It's a little early to be pushing that g pawn because it becomes a target. Now, of course, you could protect that pawn first with something like h4, but then we get this move here, knight to g3. It's a fork of the rook and bishop, and then we take out the bishop on f1. And that move is a bit of a problem for white because of the following variation, which I'm just going to show you quickly. Black should play knight to b4, targeting a2, so this knight can't go anywhere. It's tied down to defending. So you defend that pawn, and then we get something like queen c7. Once the knight jumps to b5, the queen can attack it with queen to a5, and this would be very good for white if c4 could be played without having to worry about the move d5. If the bishop was still on f1, this d5 move wouldn't work for black. You could just take with the c pawn. That's what you want to do. But here the knight's not protected. This bishop is gone, so the queen takes b5. Let me show you, in case you were wondering, what happens if you take with the e pawn. Looks like it might be reasonable, but you'll realize how bad things are after bishop to f5 check. Where's that king going? c1? Not exactly working. Queen takes b5 is the killer move, sacking the queen to open up the c file, after which rook a to c8 check is complete devastation. You can see the king has nowhere to go. You put a piece in the way. You got some serious problems here. Any of these three pieces can just take on c2 and black is totally winning. So just an example of how things can go pretty badly for white pretty quickly after this move knight to h5. But Danya did not play that move. He played knight to d7, which would have allowed Carlsen to get in the move h4 under more favorable circumstances. There's no longer this knight to g3 fork that we looked at in the previous line. And again, black should sack the knight like so in order to open things up. This time the best continuation is f6, but we didn't go down this line either, because Magnus, instead of playing this nice move h4, goes straight for knight to d5. Looks good on the surface, hopping into that big hole in the black position, but after bishop takes, you can't take with the queen, or else there'll be knight to b4 with the fork of the queen and this unprotected a2 pawn. So Magnus is forced to take with the e pawn, at which point Danya latches onto the correct idea. He plays knight to d4. We have takes, takes. Carlsen does not take on d4 yet because he knows that bishop takes g5 is coming. So he protects that pawn with f4. And we have yet another mistake. The game is already getting very complicated. Danya goes for rook to e8, but what he should have played here is f6, which Carlsen would not really have a good way to deal with. What are you going to do? You push to g6? Well, then there's going to be f5. Clearing some nice squares for the black pieces. If you were to try to take this pawn, oops-a-daisy, you're losing your knight here on a1. Maybe the knight will hop to f6 if white doesn't take on d4. If you try to add more defense to that pawn, I mean, it is hit 3 times. Let's say you play h4. Then you got this cool variation that I'm going to show you. F takes g5. If you take with the f pawn, then that clears the e5 square for the knight. Not great. You'd like to take with the h pawn so that that square is covered, but now you're running into rook takes f4. Beautiful, because if you take with the queen, white queen is gone. So f6 would have been a very unpleasant move for Magnus to have to deal with, but instead we have rook to e8, which puts the rook on an open file, but is not compatible with black's best plan, which is to play this f6 move. Carlsen immediately adds some defense to that pawn g5. We have bishop to f8, okay, opening the eyes of the rook. Magnus still does not take the pawn on d4. If you were to do that, then you'd have g6, and here comes the bishop. That's a scary diagonal to allow black. It's probably better to keep this pawn around for the moment. Magnus pushes h5, and now we get knight to c5. Now we have queen takes d4. Since the pawn has made its way to h5, if black were to try g6, then we could push to h6. There's no bishop to g7. So instead, From Danya, we have rook to e4, hitting the queen. Goes back to d2, defending the pawn on f4. We have rook to c8 now from Danya. Makes sense, putting the rook opposite Carlsen's king, which he gets out of the way right away with king to b1. Kind of a knee-jerk reaction, probably a move that most of us would play, but it's not the best move. Again, we have engine moves that are much better, and what white should actually play here is rook to h3. It's not obvious, but this pawn is becoming a grave danger, and here you have the idea of pushing the b4 and then eliminating the pawn. That's what you really should be working on doing. After king to b1 though, Danya misses his chance to play h6. A very annoying move. This pawn's under attack. You'd like to take on h6, but then there's queen to f6. A tactical theme which is going to be present for a while. If black can get a piece on this long diagonal, the most dangerous piece of course being the queen, white is going to be in a world of hurt. So checkmate is threatened. Here you have to do something. Let's say c3. Now this pawn on f4 falls. Black does not have to worry about this h-pawn doing anything. If you take on g7, well, that just helps black. Now you got the queen and bishop battery. The knight's ready to hop into e4, hitting c3 again, and the rook is being uncovered. You can see that white is on the ropes right here. So let's say you don't take the pawn on h6. What else can you do? You can try something like c4, and black will capture twice on g5, play bishop to e7, and now he's just going to go after this g-pawn. You can add defense. He'll hit it again with the rook, and if you ever push it, no big deal. Here comes bishop to g5. You can even take on f7. Who cares? The black king's just going to move here to f8 and be relatively safe. Got to move the queen. Here comes rook to a8, defending the pawn. Black is again winning. The queen's going to get into the action. Still a crazy position, and things might not be totally clear to us humans, but Stockfish is saying as white, you're completely finished if black plays this accurately. Of course, none of this stuff is obvious in a blitz game, which is why from Danya, we had this queen to b6 move instead of that very nice h6 idea. Next, we have rook to h3 from Carlsen, providing some lateral defense. Realizing b3 is a weak point here, but he should have just played c4 right away. Since this move is not really relevant to addressing what black's best plan is, which again, Danya doesn't find, he should have played rook e to e8. Looks counterintuitive, but you want to get your knight to e4 as soon as possible. That's how black makes the most of his position here. Let's say white plays c4, you jump into e4, hitting the queen. Now, if you go to d4, this isn't good. Queen takes, rook takes, and then you have knight takes g5. Pawn takes because you got rook to e1. Check, picking up the bishop. Okay, so what else can you do instead? Well, all you can do is move your queen and allow the fork. White is toast here. So you wouldn't want to play c4 in that position. You'd want to play queen to d4 and pin that knight. But Danya does not spot the idea of moving the rook off of e4 to give the knight that square yet. He plays h6, which is tricky, but it's not the best. The point is here, if Carlsen were to take on h6, then the queen could run back to d8 and it's going to f6 pretty quickly. That's dangerous because it would be threatening mate. It'd be threatening this f4 pawn here with the help of the rook. And as we said before, taking here only helps black, sets up the battery with the queen and the bishop. So Carlsen, realizing this, did not take on h6. He played c4. And Danya, realizing that this queen to d8 back to f6 maneuver is not going to be as much of a threat anymore, since after c4 the queen is covering that checkmate will not be threatened. And so at some point, g takes h6 will be a threat, which is why Danya takes on g5 now. F takes g5. And he has the right idea to move this rook now, but he moves it to the wrong square. The best place for this rook now is the e5 square. It's defended by a pawn. You're supporting knight to e4. You're putting some pressure on g5, but instead he goes for rook to g4. And this is bad because of what Carlsen could have played. Again, we're seeing inaccuracies on almost every move because this game is getting so complex. Here white could have played g6. And I'm going to show you what would happen if black were to try to win this pawn here. That, of course, was Danya's idea of putting the rook here on g4, that he could take, and then grab this pawn. I'd like to point out that playing knight to e4 first isn't working. If you play knight to e4 here, there's the beautiful rook h8 check. This force is made after the king takes and the queen goes to h2 with check. Going to come in here with checkmate. So you'd have to take the pawn on g6, but then we'd have queen to c2 hitting the rook. Rook moves. The queen gets in to h7. The rook comes to e3 to dominate the open file and to stop knight to e4. And you can see Black's pieces are really just kind of shut out of the game. This knight to e4 move is so important because not only does it get the knight to a good square, but it also opens up the queen's eyes to come in here and possibly wreak some havoc. You may be seeing something like this later in the game because of the fact that Magnus did not play this best move, g6. Let's look at some alternatives here. After this move g6, you try jumping into e4 while you can. White can take, king takes, and here there's queen to e3, which kind of forces a queen trade. You move the queen, then here comes bishop to e2, and this highlights the problem of having the rook on g4. That's not a stable square. How's the rook going to keep defending the knight? This is really the key line that demonstrates why rook g4 is bad. So here instead you would want to take out the queen, and then the rook would take. Getting ready to double up on this open file. Here's a threat of bishop to h3, followed by bishop to e6. You can see that white is in the driver's seat here. Black has this bad dark squared bishop. Black does not want the queens to come off the board. But Carlsen missed this move g6, and he instead just played knight to c2. At least he's getting this knight back into the game, but here comes knight to e4, hitting the queen. And Carlsen should really play queen to e3 here. To block this diagonal, you don't want the queen coming in here to g1. And again, if the queen drops back, Black has problems with this move, bishop to e2. How are you going to maintain defense of that knight? You're not. You should probably trade queens. The rook takes. At least he can grab the pawn on g5. White's better. Grab on a3. But now the h5 pawn comes under attack. Black has a little better prospects here than in the previous queenless line we just looked at, but this is not what happened. Magnus moved his queen to e2, after which queen to g1 is very dangerous. Magnus pushes with g6, makes some sense. Danya cannot win the pawn on g6 because the rook needs to keep defending the knight on e4, of course. So he plays rook to e8, adding defense. And now Carlsen plays this move, queen to f3, which is a mistake. He's trying to set a trap though, but it's not a trap because it doesn't work. Let's see what he should have played. He should have just taken out the pawn with check, the king takes, and then go rook to e3. Pinning the knight, and you might think, wait a minute, why not knight c3 check? What happens here? Well, you know what you do? You sack the queen. Boom, boom. Black queen's hit. Rook on g4's hit. Okay, queen to g2, bishop takes, queen takes. And the two rooks for the queen actually give white good prospects here. But once again, I digress. So many crazy lines to look at in this game. I'm trying to keep them to a minimum, but it's hard because to really understand this game, you got to look at a lot of alternative variations. But let's look at Carlsen's supposed trap here with queen to f3. Baiting Black into taking on g6, h takes, and then the rook takes here. His big idea was queen to h5. Looking for this check on h7, Danya plays rook to e5, hitting the queen. Okay, here we go. Drives the king to f7, and now bishop to e2 is a discovered attack on Danya's queen. Also threatens to come in here to h5. Almost looks like Black is just busted. And if Danya were to just move his queen out of danger, he would be finished. But he finds the correct move. Knight to d2 check. The rook cannot take the knight since it is pinned to the king. But now we have king to c1, which Danya responds to with the killer. Rook takes e2. And Carlsen realizes to his horror that he cannot take the queen now. For if rook takes g1, then rook takes g1 check will lead to mate. And we see this pawn still exerting its influence, covering the b2 square. Here white can only put a knight in the way, at which point there is knight takes b3 check, followed by rook taking on e1, which is checkmate. So obviously Magnus did not take the queen, instead plays queen to h5, pinning this rook here so it cannot recapture on g1. Queen now moves to g2 with a very grave threat of taking on c2 once this knight moves somewhere. Carlsen plays queen to f5 check. He knows he needs to get his queen back here for damage control. The black king moves, now queen to d3, defending the c2 knight here. Defending b3 against a possible knight sacrifice, which Danya executes anyway. Knight to b3 check, queen recaptures, and now rook to f6. Coming into f2. What are you going to do about that? You don't want to move the knight and allow rook takes a2. That's just curtains. So what else can you do? Well, you have to add defense to that c2 knight. Just try to cluster all your pieces together over here and just hold the fort down. Here comes the rook, and Carlsen can't really improve the defense around his king here, so he does the only thing he can do to try to get counterplay. He pushes on c5. But now Danya starts getting his last piece into the action with bishop to e7. Here comes the c-pawn, bishop to g5 check. This is a key move. You're driving the king away from the defense of this rook here on d1. King goes to b1. And now, all Danya needs to do is play rook to f1. And it's over. How are you going to defend this rook? I'll just show you a couple tries for white and how they fail. Obviously, if you take the rook here, queen to f1 check, the knight goes in the way, queen takes e1 check. White can only throw pieces in the way, which he's going to lose. All right, let's look at trying to defend the rook with this rook here. There's multiple winning moves for black. I like bishop to d2, just blocking the defense. You can take out the bishop, but then rook takes. This rook's pinned. You can play rook c1, but then we just pile up on the rook like this. Try to defend with the queen. Queen to e2. Can't take, or else this is checkmate. So I don't know, what do you do? Try to stay on this diagonal. Queen comes over here to b5. Check. Again, this pawn playing its key role in a different way. So just some examples. There's more lines to look at, but Danya does not play rook to f1. Instead of leaving the bishop where it should stay on g5, he plays bishop to f6, allowing c7. And at this point, rook to f1 is no longer a threat, and Carlsen is about to queen his pawn. Let's look at what happens if rook to f1 is played now. Well, here, you just queen your pawn with a check, and you start chasing the black king around. Where are you going to go? You want to go to g6, queen to d3, rook's defended here. Black has nothing. So let's try it as bishop takes c3. Carlsen could win by just taking out the bishop, but he says, I'll queen my pawn with check first. Usually a pretty safe thing to do. King goes to h7. Now he takes the bishop with this queen. Rook f1, but it's no longer working. We have queen to d3 check, and you can see that the game has completely and suddenly fallen apart for black. He blocks with the rook. This rook's taken off the board. The queen takes with check. Danya loses his queen. Such a tragedy. He even plays on for a few moves in a hopeless position, probably hoping to flag Carlsen. I gotta assume that they were both getting low on time here, which may explain why Danya never found that move rook to f1 we looked at. We had b4, queen takes e4 with check, at which point the game ends for obvious reasons. So just a tactical nightmare of a game. Danya playing like an absolute genius, getting this winning position here against the great Magnus Carlsen, but then in the final hour just failing to find the knockout blow, rook to f1, and Carlsen did not give him a second chance. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you found value here, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.